Hi everyone. I'm going to give you an overview of the things that I sent to Becky and that she forwarded. I want to walk you through the process and my thinking a little bit around the concepts that I selected for your consideration. First, this is the document that I was working from. I've compiled over the years a list, kind of a mother list of concepts for shaping and framing big ideas in curriculum. I use this a lot when I train people on understanding by design. And there's, this isn't like a hard and fast list, and I admit that I don't necessarily have definitions for my general concepts here. But it's a pretty good comprehensive list of different concepts. And at the top here, this is the part that's most relevant to us, is that these are what I would call the most macro or the most universal concepts. I may be missing one or two. Suggestions are always welcome, but in effect, these are the concepts that are the most transcendent, that cut across the most disciplines, and under which some of these other concepts could fit. So this was the mini list that I was working from. Not all of these are ideal for social studies content in K3, even though they are good for social studies. For example, power is a really fantastic concept for social studies, especially when we're examining history. But for K3, it's maybe not the best fit. So I use that as an example to say that when I go through this list, I tried to think about the grade level and also the content that is suggested by your standards. So in looking at this list, I ended up selecting three concepts. They were interdependence and change and identity. I know for your science frameworks, you have interdependence and patterns. Even though patterns is for historians a fantastic concept, again, given the content at K3, and even though there's more history in the third grade standards, I wouldn't say that we would necessarily focus on students on examining patterns over time or patterns in history. So it would be ideal if the science content frameworks and the social studies content frameworks could use the same two concepts, but that didn't seem possible as far as I could tell with the patterns. But let me know if you think differently on this. Now, I think you only need two overarching or universal concepts. I think that's what my charge is, but I ended up selecting these three for drafting and for consideration, just because, just to work through the concepts to see how they might work. So let's take a look at the other document that I sent, the actual vertical alignment for the unit starters, and these are of course subject to change and subject to your feedback. But the first one that I did was interdependence, and I assumed or went with the idea that the content framework that I had already drafted might be used, and that was focused on economics, needs, wants, consumers, producers, etc. So I started out with this one, and in these charts I have the grade level, the unit concept that could maybe be refined a little bit, what I would call the unit generalization that's related to that unit concept, and then some possible topics that would fit under this unit concept, and that would really guide the selection of texts. In this document where I've said possible topics, I'm not saying that all of those topics would be used. That's something that we'd need to talk about so that I have a clear understanding of the kinds of topics that might be best or for which you already have texts in mind. So I'll need your feedback on that. I also felt like with the unit concept that there might need to be, at least from the teacher point of view, if not the students, some kind of qualification of the kind of interdependence that we're talking about, whether civic or economic. So that's why I detailed that here, but that could be subject to change or feedback as well. And then you'll see in each unit generalization, the concept of interdependence or interdependent as an adjective is there. And hopefully, too, you can see, or I attempted to create a generalization that escalated in its sophistication and in its complexity. And then there are topics that relate to those generalizations. For interdependence, I noted in the side here that economic interdependence could also work for second grade because there are some standards related to imports, exports, etc., trade. So that could work in here as well. So that's the interdependence example, again, subject to your feedback. I can't wait to hear what you think. Another concept that I selected is identity. Now, I know in this political era, this day and age, the concept or the idea of identity is sometimes controversial, at least from maybe a more moderate or conservative point of view, or talking to students about identity might in the younger grades, or using that word in particular, might be a little controversial. We can talk further about that on the phone. But I do think that the idea of identity is something that primary grades teachers talk a lot about implicitly anyway. The idea of, what do we have in common, and what's shared among us, what's unique, how are we similar, how are we different. So that's why in parentheses here I was kind of trying to spell out like the more kindergarten-y way of saying this concept of identity. And the idea that communities like us as a classroom community, a school community, our broader community, the city that we live in, even if you wanted to touch a little bit on, our nation and the things that, all U.S. citizens or all people who live in the United States share, and what's unique about us, you could touch on that as well within or beyond the topics that are already suggested in the kindergarten standards. And then again, I attempted some like an escalation of the generalizations related to identity, and you can see the possible topics in the side. I'm not saying you have to use all of these as a unit concept. I was just brainstorming here if we wanted to qualify or specify what kind of identity we're talking about here, depending on the topic or topics that are chosen. And then you'll see down in third grade, we're more specific to the historical content. There are a lot of geography standards in third grade. They're pretty significant, but I say on the side here that a focus on geographic identity would work, but I feel like that's more of a pure social studies focus, and you all said last time that these are not social studies units per se. So some of the geography skills that are emphasized in the standards could still be touched on in a focus on the culture and legacy of American Indian nations, but it wouldn't have to be the emphasis. It could support rather than be the focal point. I do want to clarify too, it does say American Indian in the standard, so I don't know if that's I assume that that's the term that your state is using. Different states use different terms, so I just wanted to double check that. And then finally, I drafted another possibility around the universal concept of change, building off of some of the historical inquiry skills. The topics are somewhat suggested by the standards. In the kinder, I made some of this up a little bit with like looking at our school then and now, if we wanted to use that as a topic or a vehicle through which we see, okay, people and things change over time, and looking at the way school used to be and the way it is now. But any topics, there are other topics that could work here. I guess that's what I want to say, depending on the texts that are identified. So I have some qualifiers here too. Change with a focus on then and now. Change with a focus on past and present. Here I'm switching the use of the word change here a bit, I recognize, um, to a focus on individuals and people. This is suggested in the standards, but a focus on people like Martin Luther King, for example, who affected change, and people from the past who affected change or were difference makers. So that's a way to kind of bring that study of individuals into this framework. And then here, I don't know if this is going to be controversial or not, but the idea of changing historical perspectives and how the way people see things that happened in the past and people from the past has changed over time. It seemed like the topic of European explorers would be a good vehicle for that, like the way we used to see Columbus and how we might see him now. But there are other topics within the third grade standards that could be used with the same idea of, our perspectives on the past change over time, in response to new historical evidence that has emerged in response to just changes in society and the way that we think about different groups of people. So that can be explored in multiple ways. So again, the escalation of sophistication here is something that I attempted. These topics or similar topics could also be framed with the concept of inquiry, so that the generalizations are linked to inquiry at their focal point, not change. You could also have two universal concepts in this framework of change and inquiry, the idea that we conduct inquiry to see how things have changed over time. So that might be, I know that's different than the science, but you might have a couple different sets of generalizations, some related more to the content and some related more to the historical inquiry skills. So that's it for what I've drafted, and I look forward to talking about these frameworks tomorrow. Thanks so much.